2 guns. That was the entire output of a company that sold shares to the public and promised to arm the British Empire. In 1718, a soldier with a musket could fire 3 shots a minute, 4 if he was very good, and then he stopped to reload while the enemy kept walking toward him. That year, a machine appeared that promised 9 shots a minute from a single barrel, 3 times the rate of any weapon on any battlefield in the world. On paper, it worked. The man who built it had never fired a shot in a war. He was not a soldier. He was not an engineer. He was not a gunsmith. He was a lawyer, and the most famous thing he ever wrote was a book of moral advice from a father to his son. The British Army tested his machine and turned it down. So he stopped trying to sell the gun to the one customer that mattered and started selling something else: shares in the gun. He floated it in 1720, the year London lost its mind over paper, the year the South Sea Bubble built and destroyed fortunes in a single summer. He marketed a version that fired square bullets, on the stated theory that square wounds would teach the enemy the benefits of Christian civilization. His one real customer took 2 of the guns to seize a Caribbean island and was thrown back off it in 11 days. And when it was over, the machine ended up where the rest of the worthless ventures of 1720 ended up, printed on a satirical playing card, cutting down not the enemy, but the shareholders who had paid for it. This is the story of a gun that was a century ahead of its time, a company that made almost nothing, and what the people who bought the shares actually paid. The lawyer who never fired a shot. The gun is the famous part. The man is not. Almost everyone who has heard of the Puckle gun could describe the weapon, the tripod, the strange revolving cylinder, the square bullets. Almost no one could name a single fact about James Puckle, and that gap is the first clue to what this story is actually about. Because the weapon was never the point. The man was a promoter, and the machine was the thing he promoted. James Puckle was born in Norwich, in the county of Norfolk, in 1667. The date is reasonably firm. Much of the rest of his early life is not, and where the record is thin, this account will say so rather than fill the gaps. He was not raised in a foundry. He did not apprentice to a gunsmith. He did not serve in an army, take a commission, or, so far as any record indicates, fire a weapon in anger at any point in his life. He trained in the law. He worked, by most accounts, as a notary and a lawyer in London, in the decades on either side of the year 1700, which places him in the professional class of the city at exactly the moment that class was learning a new trick. Money could be made from paper. That is worth sitting with, because it defines everything that follows. The men who built the great weapons companies of later centuries came out of the trades. They were machinists, armorers, engineers, men who understood metal because they had spent their lives cutting it. Puckle understood documents. He understood contracts, patents, subscriptions, the machinery of ownership rather than the machinery of firing. Those are not gunsmith's skills. They are a lawyer's skills. And in the story of the Puckle gun, the lawyer's skills will matter far more than any gunsmith's ever did. Before he was an inventor, Puckle was a writer, and the thing he wrote is the first of the ironies this story will plant and later collect. In 1713, 5 years before the patent, he published a small book called The Club. It was a moral dialogue, a conversation between a father and a son, in which the father walks the young man through the various types of men he will meet in the world and warns him, gently and at length, about the vicious ones: the drunkard, the gambler, the cheat, the projector, that period's word for a man who floats a grand scheme to separate honest people from their money. The book was a modest success in its own time and an unlikely survivor afterward. It was still being reprinted at the end of the 19th century, illustrated, sold as a curiosity of plain old English wisdom. Nearly 200 years after it was written, a father could still buy his son a copy of James Puckle's advice about how to live an honest life and avoid the schemers. Hold that thought. It will be needed later, when the same man's name is attached to one of the schemes his own book had warned against. To understand why a London lawyer in his 40s decided to design a weapon, it helps to understand the world he was designing it into. England in the 1710s was a country at the beginning of an obsession, and the obsession was invention as a route to wealth. The patent system, which had existed in a rough form for over a century, was becoming a machine for turning ideas into property. A man with a clever notion could secure, from the crown, a monopoly on that notion for a term of years, and that monopoly was a thing he could sell, license, or borrow against. An idea had become an asset, and around that fact had grown up a whole population of men the period called projectors, exactly the type Puckle had catalogued in his book, who made their living not by building things but by promoting the promise of things. Puckle himself was a writer of exactly the kind of national interest tracts that fed this world. Across the 1690s, he had published a string of pamphlets on England's commerce and strength, works with titles along the lines of The Interest of England and England's Way to Wealth and Honor, The the sort of earnest, patriotic argument that treated the prosperity and the defense of the nation as a subject a thoughtful man ought to improve. He had spent decades, in other words, writing about what England needed, in trade, in money, in security against its rivals. A weapon to defend the nation against its enemies was not a strange leap for such a man. It was the same argument he had always made, now rendered in bronze and powder instead of ink. And it gave his eventual pitch a ring of sincerity that a bare opportunist could never have faked. Because the case for national strength was a case he had been making his entire working life. That is part of what makes him so difficult to convict. A cynic selling fear is easy to despise. A patriot who has always believed in national defense, and who then finds a way to profit from selling it, is a far more complicated figure, and the record leaves him standing exactly in that uncomfortable middle. This was also a country afraid. For the whole of Puckle's adult life, the great menace on the edge of the European imagination was the Ottoman Empire, the power the English simply called the Turk. The Ottomans had besieged Vienna within living memory in 1683, and the wars between the Ottoman state and the Christian powers of Europe ran on and off across the entire period. To an English audience in the 1710s, the Turk was the standing symbol of the enemy at the gate, the reason a nation needed better weapons, the villain against whom any new instrument of war could be justified. A man who wanted to sell the idea of a weapon had, ready-made, the perfect customer to frighten his backers with. He did not have to invent the fear. The fear was already there, and it was already for sale. Into that world, James Puckle brought a drawing. Not a gun, at first. A drawing, a specification, an idea rendered on paper in the exact form the patent system was built to reward. It described a weapon unlike anything then in service, a single barrel fed by a revolving block of chambers, cranked by hand, that could pour out fire at a rate no massed rank of musketeers could match. Whether Puckle designed the mechanism himself or refined an idea already circulating among the projectors and gunsmiths of the city, the records do not clearly say. What is not in dispute is that he was the man who filed it, the man who owned it, and the man who set out to make money from it. He was 51 years old. He had spent his career around contracts and clients and the slow business of the law. He had written a book warning young men about schemers. And he was about to stake his name on a machine he was not equipped to build, in an industry he had never worked in, aimed at a customer he had never met, on the strength of a fear he did not have to manufacture. It was not a gunsmith's decision. It was a promoter's. And the first thing any promoter needs is a number that sounds impossible. 9 shots a minute. The number was 9. 9 shots a minute, from a single barrel, at a time when a single barrel meant a single shot and then a long, exposed pause while a man bit a cartridge, poured powder, rammed a ball, and primed a pan, all of it by hand, all of it while the enemy closed the distance. To feel the weight of that number, one has to understand what it was measured against. The standard infantry weapon of the early 18th century was the flintlock musket, and a trained soldier with a flintlock musket could manage, on a good day, on dry ground, with steady hands, 3 shots in a minute. An exceptional soldier might reach 4. Under fire, in rain, in fear, with fouled powder and fumbling fingers, the real rate on a real battlefield was often lower, 2 shots a minute, sometimes fewer. That was the ceiling. That was the physics of massed firepower in 1718. Armies put men shoulder to shoulder in ranks precisely because no single man could generate enough fire to matter. It took 100 of them firing together to produce a wall of lead. And even then, the wall came in slow, ragged pulses, 3 beats a minute, with long silences in between. Puckle's machine attacked the silence. The design was, in its bones, a revolver. And that word should stop the modern ear, because the revolver is supposed to be a 19th century invention. Samuel Colt would not patent his revolving pistol until 1836. Puckle's specification predates Colt by more than 130 years, and it works on the same fundamental principle. A cylinder, a rotating block bored with several chambers, each chamber preloaded with powder and ball, is brought one at a time into line behind a single fixed barrel. Fire the chamber, release the crank, rotate the next loaded chamber into place, lock it, fire again. When the cylinder is empty, the crew does not reload 11 times. They take the whole cylinder off and fit a fresh loaded one in its place. The reload is not a cartridge, it is a magazine. That last idea is worth dwelling on, because it is the part that was truly ahead of its time. The great limit on firepower was never only how fast a man could fire, it was how fast he could reload once his shots were spent. Puckle's answer, to load the ammunition into a detachable block that could be swapped in one motion for a fresh block already prepared, is the same instinct that would eventually give the world the detachable magazine, the thing that lets a modern soldier empty a weapon and refill it in seconds. The specific mechanism was clumsy, and the manufacturing was beyond the age. But the concept, prepare the ammunition in advance, in a unit, and change the whole unit rather than the individual round was exactly right. It would take a century and a half and better metal to make it work. The thinking was already there, on paper, in 1718. The specifications, as they survive, describe a serious piece of hardware and not a toy. A barrel, roughly 3 feet long. A bore of about 1¼ inches, which is a large caliber, closer to a light cannon than a musket, firing a ball no one would want to be standing in front of. A cylinder holding, depending on the configuration, somewhere between 6 and 11 charges. The whole thing mounted not on a man's shoulder but on a tripod, a fixed stand, because it was never meant to be carried into a charge. It was a defensive weapon, a position weapon, a thing bolted to the deck of a ship or set at the top of a breach to break up a boarding party or a storming column. That is why its maker called it, in plain language, the defense gun. Remember that name. It was chosen to sell an idea, protection one could install, and by the end of this story, the name will have turned completely inside out. The mechanism deserves one more moment, because its cleverness is real, and it explains both the promise and the fragility in a single stroke. Each chamber in the revolving cylinder was pre-charged, loaded in advance with powder and ball, and brought into line with the barrel by hand, then screwed tight against the breech so that chamber and barrel sealed as one solid piece before the flint fell. That screwing action, tightening the seal and then loosening it again for every single shot, was the whole price of the design. It was what let the gun reuse one fixed barrel over and over, without the barrel fouling and overheating as fast as a bundle of separate barrels would, and it was also the exact thing that made the weapon slow and delicate to serve, a machine that demanded a trained crew performing a sequence of small, precise motions under the noise and fear of combat. Some versions were described firing a single large ball. Others were built to throw a cluster of smaller ones at once, as many as 16 musket balls in a single discharge, which turned the defense gun into something closer to a rapid-firing scattergun for sweeping the crowded deck of a ship or the mouth of a breach. It was ingenious on paper and in the courtyard. It was also precisely the kind of intricate, tolerance-dependent object that the workshops of 1718 could produce, only one slow, hand-fitted piece at a time, which is a wonderful quality in a museum exhibit and a fatal one in a weapon meant to arm an empire. There is one demonstration that survives in enough detail to quote, and it is the demonstration that gives the number its documentary spine. At a public trial, generally dated to 1722, the gun was fired for an audience, and the reported result was 63 shots in 7 minutes. Work the arithmetic, and it lands at 9 rounds a minute, exactly the figure the design had promised. And it lands there, including the time taken to change cylinders, which is the part that matters, because the whole promise of the weapon was that the reload would not kill the rate of fire. 63 shots in 7 minutes against 3 shots a minute from a musket. On the raw comparison of firepower, it was not close. And here is the detail that the story deserves, the one that makes the trial feel like a scene rather than a statistic. According to the accounts, that demonstration was conducted in a driving rainstorm. That was not an accident of the weather. That was the whole point. The single greatest weakness of every flintlock weapon on Earth was rain, because a flintlock fires by scraping a flint against steel to throw sparks into a small pan of loose priming powder, and wet priming powder does not spark and does not fire. Rain was the thing that silenced 18th century armies. So to fire the defense gun in the rain, in front of an audience, and to keep it firing 63 times, was a sales pitch aimed straight at the weapon's most obvious objection. It said, in effect, watch this thing do the one thing an ordinary musket cannot. It was a good pitch. It was a real number. The mechanism was genuinely ahead of its time, and there is no honesty in pretending otherwise. The men who later built the machine guns that changed warfare were working out, with better metallurgy and better ammunition, an idea this lawyer had drawn on paper in 1718. The technology was not the lie in this story. The technology, in fact, was the most truthful thing about it. But a rate of fire is not a weapon, and a weapon is not a business. And the number 9, however impressive in a courtyard on a wet afternoon, was about to meet a different kind of number entirely. Because the men who actually bought guns for a living, the men with an army to arm and a budget to answer for, were not going to ask how many shots it could fire in 7 minutes. They were going to ask a colder question. And the answer to that question was the one the defense gun could not survive. The arithmetic of the no. The customer that mattered was the crown, and the crown said no. In the England of 1718, there was really only one buyer worth the name for a weapon like this. Private men owned guns, ships carried guns. But the great purchaser, the one whose order could turn an inventor into a fortune, was the government, and specifically the Board of Ordnance, the body that armed the army and the navy. Win the board, and an inventor had a customer with an empire's budget and an empire's appetite. Lose the board, and he had a clever machine, and nowhere to sell it. Everything depended on that one door. The gun was put to the test. The trial is generally placed at Woolwich, the great arsenal on the Thames where England proved its ordnance, and it is dated to around 1717, before the patent was even granted, which shows that Puckle went looking for the official customer first, exactly as a rational man would. He brought the wonder weapon to the people whose business was weapons, and they turned it down. The reason they turned it down is the heart of this chapter, and it needs stating carefully, because the easy version of this story treats the rejection as stupidity, as short-sighted men failing to recognize the future when it was handed to them on a tripod. That version is comforting, and it is wrong. The board's objection was not ignorance, it was arithmetic. Start with the flintlock. The whole demonstration in the rain was designed to answer the reliability objection, and it is telling that the objection needed answering, because everyone in the room already knew the truth. Flintlocks were unreliable. A single flintlock musket, in ordinary service, misfired often enough that soldiers were trained to expect it. Now take that unreliability and multiply it. The defense gun did not have one flintlock mechanism to fail. It had a complicated rotating cylinder, a hand crank, a locking system to seal each chamber to the barrel in turn, and a firing mechanism that had to work in sequence, again and again, faster than a man could think. Every one of those parts was a thing that could jam, foul, misalign, or break. A musket that misfires costs one shot. A machine like this that misfires costs the machine, and possibly the crew, because a chamber that does not seal properly against the barrel can vent burning gas and lead sideways into the men working it. There was also the matter of everything that surrounds a weapon, the part inventors forget and quartermasters never do. A new gun is not just a gun, it is a supply chain. It needs its own ammunition, and the defense gun needed special preloaded cylinders and, in its stranger version, special square-cast shot, none of which the existing system produced or knew how to produce in quantity. It needs trained men, and there were no men trained to serve a rapid-fire position gun because no such gun existed anywhere in service to have trained them. It needs a place in the drill, the doctrine, the tactics, and there was no such place, no slot in the order of battle shaped to receive it. The Board of Ordnance was not merely judging a machine on a stand. It was judging the entire apparatus a machine drags behind it. And for this one, the apparatus did not exist and would cost a great deal to invent, all in order to field a weapon that jammed in the wet conditions ordinary muskets shrugged off. Seen the way the board had to see it, the no was not timidity, and it was not a failure of vision. It was a correct reading of the total cost of adoption. And total cost of adoption is the number that kills more good inventions than bad engineering ever has. Now add the money. The defense gun was not a musket. It was a precision object, hand-built, with tolerances that the metalworking of 1718 could barely hold. It had to be made by skilled hands, one at a time, at a cost that no one has recorded precisely but that everyone understood to be many times the cost of a standard musket. For the price of one temperamental defense gun, the board could arm a file of soldiers with reliable muskets, and reliable was the word that mattered. An army does not want the highest possible rate of fire from one fragile position. An army wants a weapon that a frightened 19-year-old can operate in the mud, in the dark, after a 20-mile march, and have it work. The musket was that weapon. The defense gun was not. And add the last thing, the thing that is easiest to miss from 3 centuries away. There was no place for it. Armies of 1718 fought in a particular way, in lines and columns, with massed infantry delivering volleys and then closing with the bayonet. There was no doctrine, no tactical slot, no trained role for a rapid-fire position weapon on a tripod. Even if the gun had worked perfectly, the board would have had to invent a way to use it, a way to move it, a way to supply it with its special cylinders and its special ammunition, a way to fit it into a battlefield that had no gap shaped like it. The Gatling gun, 150 years later, would take decades to find its place, even when it worked reliably. Puckle's machine, in 1718, was a solution reaching for a problem the army did not yet know it had. So the board did the sum. Unreliable, times expensive, times useless in the existing order of battle equals no. It was not a complicated judgment, it was a fast one. And by the ordinary logic of the arms trade, it should have been the end. The one real customer had examined the product, understood it, and declined. A gunsmith, hearing that no, would have gone back to the workshop to fix the reliability, or moved on to the next design, or taken a job. That is what a man in the weapons business does when the weapons business rejects him. James Puckle was not in the weapons business. He was in the promotion business. And a man in the promotion business hears the word no completely differently. Where the gunsmith heard the end of a product, the lawyer heard the end of one particular customer. And there was, he understood, more than one kind of customer in the world. There was the customer who buys the gun, and there was the customer who buys a piece of the company that owns the gun. The Board of Ordnance had refused to be the first kind, but the second kind was about to become, for a brief and delirious window of history, the most numerous and least careful customer London had ever seen. The gun had failed its test. That failure, in the hands of most men, would have closed the story. In the hands of this man, it opened the real one. When the customer won't buy, sell the company. Here is the pivot on which the entire story turns, and it is a pivot that has nothing to do with guns. When the Board of Ordnance said no, James Puckle faced the oldest decision in commerce. He had a product the expert buyer would not purchase. He could improve the product, which was slow, expensive, and uncertain, and which would have required engineering skills he did not have. Or he could change what he was selling. He could stop selling the gun and start selling the idea of the gun to people who were not experts, who would never test it in the rain, and who wanted not a weapon but a stake in the profits a weapon might one day bring. He could stop looking for a buyer and start looking for investors. That is the move. And it deserves to be named plainly, because it is the thing that separates the Puckle gun from every other curious old weapon in the museums. The Puckle gun is not remembered because it was a good gun. It was not a good gun. It is remembered because it became, in the space of a couple of years, one of the earliest examples in British history of a weapon sold not as a weapon but as a security, a thing one invested in rather than fired, a share certificate wearing the costume of a machine of war. The product was no longer the gun. The product was the company. To understand why that pivot was even available, one has to understand what had happened to the very idea of a company in the England of Puckle's lifetime. For most of history, to own part of a business, a man had to be in the business, a partner, personally liable, personally involved. But over the 17th century, a new instrument had matured and spread, the joint stock company, an entity whose ownership was divided into shares, small transferable pieces that anyone with money could buy, hold, and sell on without ever setting foot in the enterprise. The buyer did not have to understand the trade. He did not have to work. He bought the paper, and if the paper rose in value, he sold it to the next man, and the difference was his. The share had cut the link between owning a business and understanding it. And once that link is cut, the door is open to a very particular kind of enterprise, one whose real product is not whatever it claims to make, but the shares themselves. Around this instrument had grown the profession Puckle had mocked in his own book 5 years earlier, the projector. The man who does not build the mine, or the fishery, or the trading voyage, but who floats the company, sells the subscriptions, takes his cut, and lets the buyers sort out later whether there was ever anything underneath. A projector does not need his scheme to work. He needs his scheme to sell. Those are not the same skill. And the gap between them, the gap between a thing that works and a thing that sells, is the exact gap the defense gun was about to fall into. Because it was a thing that sold much better than it worked. That gap has a name in every era. And in Puckle's era, the name was the projector, the very figure his own book had warned young men to avoid. The projector's real skill was never the scheme itself. It was the ability to make a scheme feel inevitable, to wrap a fragile idea in enough confident language and official-looking paper that a stranger would hand over money for a share of the outcome. And the reason the projector flourished exactly then, rather than a century earlier or later, is that the instruments had finally caught up with the instinct. The joint stock share, the transferable subscription, the newspaper advertisement, the coffeehouse market where paper changed hands all day, all of it had matured into a working system for converting a promise into cash and then converting that cash into someone else's problem. A generation before, a man with a rejected weapon and a good story would have had nowhere to take it. By 1720, there was an entire marketplace built to receive precisely that combination, no questions asked. And Puckle, standing on his patent with his pamphleteer's pen and his lawyer's understanding of how a company is born, was almost uniquely equipped to walk into it. Puckle had every tool a projector needed, and this is where the strange shape of his career suddenly makes sense. He was a lawyer, so he understood the legal machinery of forming a company and issuing its shares. He was a writer, so he could produce the persuasive language a subscription needed, the prospectus, the pitch, the promise. And he held a patent, which gave the whole thing a spine of apparent legitimacy, a monopoly granted by the crown itself, a piece of genuine property that could be waived in front of a wavering buyer. He was not a good weapons man, but he was an almost perfectly equipped promotion man, and the weapon had just been freed, by the board's rejection, from the burden of ever having to actually work. A gun the army has bought has to perform. A gun the army has refused, sold instead to investors, only has to seem like it might one day perform, in some better future, once the company has raised enough money to perfect it. The failure at Woolwich did not kill the gun. It converted it. It turned a rejected weapon into an open-ended promise. And open-ended promises were about to become the most valuable commodity in England. There was, however, one thing a subscription still needed, one thing the paper could not supply on its own. It needed a story. Investors do not put money into rate-of-fire tables and tripod dimensions. They put money into a picture of the profit those things will bring, a vision of the enemy this weapon will defeat and the fortunes its makers will earn. Puckle needed a villain grand enough to justify the machine and frightening enough to loosen a wallet, and he had already written that villain into the patent itself, in a detail so strange that it has kept the Puckle gun famous for 300 years, and that was, underneath the strangeness, a piece of marketing aimed with real precision at the fears of the men whose money he wanted. He was going to sell them a weapon against the Turk. And to do it, he was going to promise them square bullets. Patent number 418. Before the story, there was the paper, and the paper had a number, 418. That was the number of Puckle's patent, granted in 1718, and the number matters because of how small it is. 418 patents, across the entire span of English patenting up to that year. Invention as property was still a young idea, still rare enough that every grant could be counted, and Puckle's sat near the leading edge of it. To hold a patent in 1718 was not the routine act it would later become. It was to own a piece of a system that was still, itself, being invented. The exact day is one of the small things the records disagree on. Some accounts give the grant as the 15th of May, 1718. Others place it later in the summer. The day does not change the story. What changes the story is what the document was, and here the Puckle patent has a genuine claim to significance that has nothing to do with weapons at all. For most of the history of English patents, the grant was a vague thing. A man received a monopoly on an invention described in only the loosest terms, a title, a sentence, a gesture at what the thing was supposed to do. There was often no requirement to explain how it worked, no drawing, no detailed account that a later maker could follow. The patent protected a name more than a mechanism. But over the early 18th century, that began to change, and the law began to demand something new, a specification. A full written description of the invention and the manner in which it operated, precise enough that another person could understand exactly what had been claimed. James Puckle's patent, number 418, is frequently cited as one of the earliest to carry such a detailed specification. The document did not just say that he had invented a gun, it described the gun. It laid out the mechanism, the operation, the intent, in the kind of exact language that the modern patent would inherit. That sounds like a dry legal footnote, and in one sense it is. But look at what it did for a promoter. A vague patent is hard to sell shares against because there is nothing to point to, nothing concrete, nothing that looks like real property. A detailed specification, with drawings and claims and the seal of the crown, is a document a promoter can put in front of an investor with the words, "This is a genuine thing, described in full, protected by law, owned by me." The specification did not make the gun work any better. It made the gun ownable in a way an investor could believe in. The very legal machinery that made the patent modern also made it marketable, and a man who understood the law, as Puckle did, would have understood that instinctively. The paper was the asset. The gun was the illustration. It is worth understanding how young that whole idea still was. The legal foundation of English patents ran back to the Statute of Monopolies of 1624, which had reined in the Crown's old habit of selling monopolies to its favorites, and preserved only the monopoly granted to the true and first inventor of a genuinely new manufacture. But for most of the century that followed, a patent stayed a thin thing, a grant attached to a name and a loose description of what the thing was meant to do. The demand that an inventor lodge a full, working specification, a written account precise enough that a competent stranger could build the invention from it, hardened only gradually across the early 1700s, and Puckle's grant sits among the early, frequently cited examples of that new precision. That timing is not a side note to this story. A man promoting a company needs his central asset to look solid, and a detailed specification sealed by the Crown looked far more solid to a nervous investor than the vague grants of the previous age ever had. The very modernization of the patent, intended to make invention honest and reproducible and to stop men claiming what they had not truly invented, also happened to make a patent easier to sell shares against. Puckle, a lawyer by training, was standing at precisely the spot where those two effects crossed, and he was better placed than almost any gunsmith to understand what the crossing was worth. And a reading of what that paper actually described reveals that the inventor had already thought about the story he would sell. Because the specification did not describe one weapon. It described, in effect, two, distinguished not by their mechanism but by their ammunition, and by the enemy that ammunition was meant for. The patent laid out two kinds of projectile: round bullets, of the ordinary sort, for one kind of foe, and square bullets, genuinely square, for another. The difference between them was not engineering, it was theology. And it is the strangest sentence in the whole strange history of this gun. Square bullets for the Turk. The patent specified that the round bullets were for use against Christian enemies, and the square bullets were for use against the Turks. That is not a later embellishment. It is not a legend that grew up around the gun. It is in the document, in the period's own language, and the reasoning it gave is the part that has kept audiences staring at it for 3 centuries. The square bullets, the patent explained, would do the Turks more harm. And there was a purpose to that harm beyond mere effectiveness. The square projectiles were meant, in the words that have come down from the specification, to convince the Turks of the benefits of Christian civilization. Read that again slowly, because every layer of it is doing a job. On its surface, it is a claim about wounds, that a square ball tears a worse hole than a round one, and would therefore be crueler to the enemy it struck. As a matter of physics, that claim is close to nonsense. A square projectile flies worse, loses energy faster, and is harder to make and load, and there is no serious sense in which it was a battlefield improvement. So, if the square bullet was bad engineering, why put it in the patent at all? Because the square bullet was never really about engineering. It was about the story. It told the reader, in a single vivid image, exactly who this weapon was for and exactly which fear it was built to answer. And the fear was the Turk. This is where the marketing of the defense gun locks into the anxieties of its time with real precision. The Ottoman Empire, as the earlier chapter set out, was the standing enemy of the Christian European imagination, the besieger of Vienna, the power at the gate. To an English investor in the early 1720s, the Turk was not a neighbor or a trading rival, but a symbol, the ultimate other, the enemy against whom any weapon, any cruelty, any expense could be justified in advance. By writing the Turk into the patent, and by giving the Turk a special bullet, a worse bullet, a punishing bullet, Puckle was not designing ammunition. He was designing a pitch. He was telling every potential backer a small, complete story, that this machine existed to defend Christendom against its oldest foe, and that a man who put his money into it was putting his money on the right side of a holy fight. The square bullet made the abstract concrete. It turned a rate-of-fire table into a crusade. It is worth being careful and fair here, because it would be easy to read modern intentions into an 18th century document, and the record does not reveal what was inside Puckle's head. Whether he believed the square bullets would work, whether he thought them a serious military proposal, or understood them as the rhetorical flourish they plainly were, cannot be established from what survives. What can be established is the effect. The square bullet clause is the single most memorable feature of the entire patent, the thing everyone remembers and repeats, and it functioned exactly as a memorable feature functions in a sales pitch. It gave the weapon an identity. It gave the frightened investor a villain. It wrapped a fragile, rejected, overcomplicated machine in the language of religious war. And religious war has always been easier to sell than ballistics. And the war was not merely symbolic in those years. It was current news. In the very period around Puckle's patent, the Ottoman Empire and the Christian powers were once again openly at war. The long struggle of Venice and Austria against the Ottomans ran hot from 1714. And in 1716 and 1717, the Habsburg commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy, won a run of celebrated victories, culminating in the storming of Belgrade in 1717, before the Treaty of Passarowitz brought a pause in 1718, the very year of the patent. An English reader in 1718, opening a newspaper, would have found the Turk not as an ancient bogeyman out of the last century, but as a live headline, a real army fighting real battles at the edge of Christian Europe, winning and losing real cities. So when the defense gun's specification named the Turk as the enemy its square bullets were meant to punish, it was reaching for the most immediate, most saleable fear on the market, a fear freshly restocked that very season by events every coffeehouse in London already knew by heart. The marketing was not eccentric, and it was not random. It was timely, which is the quality that separates a pitch that lands from a pitch that is merely strange. There is a grim symmetry worth naming, and the format's discipline is to name it and move on, not to sermonize. A weapon marketed on the promise of teaching a foreign enemy a lesson through superior wounds would, within a few short years, become famous for the harm it did to exactly one group of people. And that group would not be Turkish, and it would not be on any battlefield. It would be the men who bought the shares. But that reckoning is still ahead. In the moment of the pitch, the square bullet did its work. It made the defense gun unforgettable, and unforgettable is the first thing a promoter needs, because the pitch was ready now. The inventor had his impossible number, 9 shots a minute in the rain. He had his instrument, patent 418, a genuine piece of crown-granted property described in full. And he had his story, a Christian machine against the Turk, complete with a bullet designed to make the point. He had everything a subscription needs, except the thing no promoter can manufacture alone, a crowd of buyers reckless enough to hand real money to a rejected weapon on the strength of a story. And in the year 1720, that crowd did not have to be manufactured either. It arrived, by the tens of thousands, in the greatest speculative fever England had ever seen. The defense gun did not create the madness of 1720. It simply floated into it, at exactly the right moment, wearing exactly the right costume. The year London lost its mind. In the summer of 1720, a share in the South Sea Company cost about £1,000. In January of that same year, the same share had cost about 128. By December, it would cost around 124 again. The entire arc, the climb to 1,000 and the collapse back to nothing, happened inside a single year. And in the space between those numbers, a nation gained and lost more paper wealth than it had ever imagined existed. This was the world the defense gun floated into. To understand how a rejected weapon found buyers, one first has to understand the fever that made almost anything findable of buyers. The South Sea Company had been founded in 1711, and its real business was never the South Seas. It was a financial engine dressed as a trading firm. Its purpose was to take on chunks of the enormous British national debt, the debt left behind by decades of war, and to convert that debt into company shares, offering the government's creditors stock in place of what they were owed. In 1713, the company was granted a monopoly on British trade to Spanish America, which sounded magnificent and delivered almost nothing, because Spain permitted only a trickle of actual commerce. But the trade was never the point. The scheme was the point, and the scheme was audacious. In 1720, the company proposed to absorb the bulk of the national debt, tens of millions of pounds of it, in exchange for its shares. And to make that work, the shares had to rise. And to make the shares rise, the company and its friends talked them up relentlessly, and the public, watching the price climb, climbed in after it. What followed was the thing every generation since has recognized, and no generation has managed to avoid. The rising price became its own advertisement. Men bought not because they had studied the company, but because the price was going up, and going up meant money, and money meant get in now before it goes up further. Fortunes appeared on paper overnight. Servants speculated, clergymen speculated, members of parliament speculated, and quietly took bribes in shares to keep the scheme alive. The coffee houses of Exchange Alley became a churning market where the whole city seemed to be buying and selling pieces of a promise. Even the careful were pulled in. Isaac Newton, the foremost mind of the age, master of the Royal Mint, a man whose entire life's work was the measurement of forces, put his money into South Sea stock, took a profit, watched the price keep climbing after he had sold, could not bear to stand outside the fortune everyone else was making, and bought back in near the top. He is reported to have lost around £20,000, a sum that would have been a life-changing fortune, and to have said afterward that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies but not the madness of people. Whether or not that exact quotation is his, the loss is real, and it is the perfect measure of the year. If Newton could not keep his head, the ordinary buyer had no chance at all. And here is the part that matters most for the defense gun. The South Sea frenzy did not stay contained within the South Sea Company. It spilled. When people are desperate to buy shares, and there are not enough real companies to sell them, promoters appear to supply the shortage, and in 1720 they appeared in a swarm. These were the bubble companies. Hundreds of them, floated in a matter of months, each one a scheme selling subscriptions to a public that had stopped asking hard questions. Some were plausible, many were absurd. There were companies to insure against losses from servants, companies to import walnut trees, companies to build ships against pirates, companies to extract silver from lead, companies to make a wheel for perpetual motion. And there was, in the most famous example of the whole mania, a company floated by a promoter who advertised it as an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. He asked subscribers to put down 2 guineas apiece against future riches he declined to describe, collected a reported £2,000 in a single morning, and, according to the story, left the country that same afternoon and was never seen again. The buyers had handed money to a blank. That was the temperature of 1720. That was the crowd. Into this, a rejected weapon with a good story was not a hard sell. It was almost a natural one. It had a real patent, which put it ahead of the pure blanks. It had a fearsome purpose and a memorable pitch, the Christian machine against the Turk. It had a number that sounded like the future. And it asked only that a man buy a share and wait for the profits that this world-changing engine of war would surely one day bring. In an ordinary year, a gun the Board of Ordnance had already refused would have found no investors at all. In 1720, being refused by the experts was almost beside the point, because the buyers were no longer listening to experts. They were listening to the price, and to the promise, and to each other. The authorities could see where it was heading. In June of 1720, Parliament passed what became known as the Bubble Act, a law aimed at exactly this swarm of companies, restricting the formation of joint stock enterprises without proper authority, a royal charter, or an act of Parliament behind them. The law was meant to protect the public, though it also, conveniently, protected the South Sea Company from the smaller schemes competing for the same money. It is worth seeing, briefly, how the central machine actually turned, because its logic is the logic the whole swarm imitated. The South Sea directors, with the financier John Blunt among the driving figures, offered the holders of government debt a swap, their dull, fixed government annuities in exchange for exciting, rising company shares. The higher the share price climbed, the fewer shares the company had to surrender for each slice of debt it absorbed, and the more shares were left over for the directors to sell into the frenzy for hard cash. In plain terms, the scheme's profit depended directly on the price going up, which handed the men running it every possible reason to talk it toward the sky, through friendly newspapers, through loans arranged so the public could buy still more stock, through shares quietly gifted to politicians whose goodwill was useful. It was a machine for manufacturing optimism, and for a few months it worked beyond anyone's imagining. The stock passed £1,000 in the high summer of 1720, and then confidence cracked. In the autumn, the fall began, and by the last months of the year the price had collapsed back toward where it had started, destroying on the way down nearly everyone who had believed the story near the top. The defense gun was one small pane in that enormous shattering window, and when the window went, it went too. But laws are slow and manias are fast. The fever ran on through the summer, past the peak, into the autumn, and then the thing every bubble does at last, it broke. And when a market like that breaks, it does not break gently, and it does not break only for the reckless. It breaks for everyone holding paper, including the man in Norwich-born middle age who had just spent the fever selling shares in a gun. 2 shillings a share. The documents that survive from the actual selling of the defense gun are thin, and honesty requires saying so, because the temptation with a story like this is to describe the subscription in more detail than the record can support. What can be established is the shape of it, and the shape is enough. There was a company. It has come down under names like the Puckle Machine Company, an enterprise formed to promote and to manufacture the gun, and its activity is documented in the period right around the peak and immediate aftermath of the bubble, roughly 1720 into 1721. There was a subscription, an offering of shares to the public, advertised in the ordinary channels of the day, and there is at least one concrete trace of the terms, preserved in a newspaper notice, a reference in the Daily Courant, one of London's papers, to the arrangements of the offering, including the detail that a named individual, a Peter Hartop, was to be paid a sum of 2 shillings on each share. 2 shillings a share. It is a small, specific, oddly human number, the kind of administrative detail that survives by accident when the grander claims have all evaporated, and it is one of the few hard facts that survive about the money side of the defense gun. 2 shillings a share reveals what kind of enterprise this was. This was not a company raising a war chest to build a factory and arm a nation. This was a promotion, structured like the promotions all around it in 1720, in which the shares themselves were the product being moved, and men took their cut on the moving. The machinery of the offering, the notices, the named agents, the per-share payments, is the machinery of stock promotion, not of manufacturing. And that is the quiet tell running underneath the whole venture. A real arms manufacturer's records are full of the gun. Orders, materials, wages, deliveries, tests. The defense gun's records are full of the shares. Look at the timing, too. And the promotion sits squarely inside the fever rather than beside it. The subscription activity clusters around 1720 and into 1721, through the peak and then the immediate wreckage of the bubble, exactly when the public appetite for shares in almost anything was at its most extreme and, a little later, at its most desperate. The Bubble Act of June 1720 had, in principle, made it harder to float a joint stock venture without proper authority behind it. But a scheme built around a genuine royal patent had a readier answer to that objection than the walnut tree companies and perpetual motion wheels did, because the patent was itself a grant from the crown, a piece of real legal standing that most of the swarm could not show. Whether the venture ever cleared the legal bar entirely cleanly is not something the surviving record settles, and this account will not pretend it does. What the record does show is a promotion using the ordinary instruments of the mania, the public notices, the named agents, the per-share commissions, to move paper at precisely the moment the buying public had lost the habit of asking what stood behind the paper at all. There were, to be fair, real guns. A promotion needs a prop, something physical to show the doubters, and a handful of actual defense guns were made, cast and finished by working founders of the period. The gun-making is associated with the Bagley Foundry, the family of bell and ordnance founders in London, skilled men who could cast and bore a serious piece of metal. So somewhere behind the paper there was hot bronze and real barrels and a small number of finished machines. But the number was small, and this is the fact that convicts the enterprise more completely than any satirist ever did. Across the entire life of the company, the total production of defense guns appears to have been not in the hundreds, not in the dozens, but in the single figures. 2, by several accounts. Perhaps 3. A company that sold shares to the public on the promise of arming men against the enemies of Christendom manufactured, in the end, a quantity of guns countable on a single hand. Set the two numbers beside each other, and the whole story is in the gap between them. Shares sold to an unknown number of hopeful buyers. Guns produced, 2 or perhaps 3. That gap is not a detail. That gap is the enterprise. The paper vastly outran the product, which is the defining signature of every bubble venture of 1720, and the defense gun wore that signature as plainly as any walnut tree company or perpetual motion wheel in the whole swarm. Whether that makes James Puckle a swindler is a question the records do not answer, and the forensic habit of this account is to leave it open rather than to convict on suspicion. It is entirely possible that he believed in his gun, that he thought the money would perfect it, that he saw himself not as a projector fleecing the public, but as an inventor at last finding the backing the short-sighted Board of Ordnance had denied him. It is also possible that he understood exactly what kind of paper he was selling into exactly what kind of year. The man who had written a book warning young men against the projector may have become one, or may only have looked like one in the ruthless light of hindsight. What is beyond dispute is the structure. A rejected weapon, a story built on fear, a subscription floated in the maddest market in English history, and a production run of 2. Those are the facts, and the facts are damning enough without a verdict on the man's soul. But there was one thing missing from the promotion, one thing all the shares in the world could not supply. The company had sold the promise of a weapon. It had not yet sold the weapon itself to anyone who would carry it into an actual fight. And then, out of the wreckage of the bubble year, a single real customer stepped forward, a nobleman with a private dream of empire and the money to chase it. He would take the defense gun off the paper and onto a ship. He would give it the one thing it had never had, a battlefield. And the battlefield would destroy him, the only real sale. His name was John Montague, the second Duke of Montague, and he was exactly the kind of man a promoter dreams of, a rich one with an appetite for grand schemes and enough distance from the details to say yes. He came from one of the great families of England, he moved in the highest circles of the court, and years later he would even hold the office of Master General of the Ordnance, the very body that armed the nation. But in the early 1720s, his imagination had fixed on something more romantic than committee work. He wanted islands. He wanted, specifically, a private empire in the Caribbean, and he was prepared to spend a fortune to build one. The islands he wanted were St. Lucia and St. Vincent, in the Lesser Antilles, in that chain of green volcanic peaks that runs down the eastern edge of the Caribbean. The Duke had obtained a grant, a claim on the 2 islands, and he set about mounting an expedition to take possession of them, to plant a colony, to raise his flag over territory that would be his in a way that no inherited English acre could ever quite be. It was the age of the projector applied to empire itself, the private venture into new land, financed by a great man's purse and a great man's confidence. And an expedition to seize contested tropical islands would need arms, and the Duke, casting about for the means to defend his new colony, found the defense gun. This is the moment the whole promotion had been waiting for, and it is worth pausing on how well the two things fit. The defense gun had been built and marketed as precisely this kind of weapon, a position gun, a thing set on a stand to break up an attack on a fixed point. It was not made to march, it was made to hold. And a small colony on a distant island, far from reinforcement, surrounded by rivals, is nothing but a set of fixed points that must be held. On paper, the match was ideal. The wonder weapon that could fire 9 shots a minute, that could keep firing in the rain, that had been designed to defend a threatened Christian outpost against a more numerous foe, was going to defend a threatened outpost against a more numerous foe. The story the shares had been sold on was about to be tested in the world. The Duke bought 2 of the guns. 2. It is, once again, the number that runs through this entire history like a watermark, and here it arrives at its sharpest. The total confirmed field deployment of the defense gun, the machine sold to the public as the future of war, consisted of 2 examples loaded aboard a private expedition to a pair of small islands. This was not a national army adopting a new weapon. This was one rich enthusiast buying the only 2 guns the venture would ever really sell to a fighting customer, and carrying them off to a corner of the Caribbean to find out whether the promise was true. It is worth understanding that Montague was not eccentric in wanting this. The private colonial venture was a fashion of the age, the same speculative energy that drove the bubble redirected from paper toward palm trees. A great man with a grant and a purse could, in principle, plant a colony, work it, and reap the sugar wealth that was making other men into lords, and the risk felt worth the prize when the prize was an island of one's own. Montague had the fortune to attempt it, and the standing to obtain the grant, and he approached it as a serious enterprise, fitting out ships, recruiting colonists and soldiers, and arming them for the fight he knew a contested island might bring. In that light, his choice of the defense gun is almost a compliment to Puckle's marketing. Here was a wealthy, intelligent man, buying arms for a real expedition to a real and dangerous place, and the weapon he reached for was the wonder machine, the position gun built for exactly the outnumbered stand a new colony might have to make. The pitch had worked on precisely the kind of customer it was designed to persuade. The only thing left to test was whether the gun could do what the pitch had promised, and the Caribbean was about to run that test under the harshest possible conditions. The expedition itself was placed under the command of an experienced seaman named Nathaniel Uring, a merchant captain and mariner who had spent years in Caribbean waters and who left an account of the venture that is one of the reasons its shape is known so precisely. Uring was a competent, practical man handed an impractical mission, and his job was to carry the colonists and the soldiers across the Atlantic, land them on St. Lucia, and establish the Duke's claim on the ground. The force that sailed was not enormous, but it was not trivial either. Several hundred people meant to become the seed of a permanent colony, with officers to govern them and men to defend them. And somewhere in the holds, the 2 defense guns, the physical remainder of a paper empire, going at last to war. They crossed the ocean through the back end of 1722, and as the ships came down toward the islands in the last days of December, everything about the situation still fit the story. A small Christian expedition, a fixed position to be defended, a wonder weapon aboard designed for exactly that fight. If the defense gun was ever going to justify the shares, ever going to fire in anger, ever going to become the thing the patent and the pitch had promised, it would be here, on the beaches of St. Lucia, in the final week of 1722. The guns had finally reached their battlefield. The battlefield lasted 11 days. 11 days. The expedition landed on St. Lucia on the 28th of December, 1722. Uring's people came ashore to begin the work of the colony, several hundred of them, the governors and officers and men who were to make the Duke's claim a fact on the ground. The precise composition, as it comes down in the accounts, was on the order of 2 governors, some 51 officers, and around 425 other men. A small society landing on a strange coast to build something permanent. And for a few days, they did the ordinary things that the beginning of a colony requires. They landed stores. They looked at the ground. They began to establish themselves on an island they had been told was theirs. The trouble was that another power did not agree that the island was theirs, and that power was closer, stronger, and far quicker to react. France held Martinique and Guadeloupe, substantial colonies within easy reach of St. Lucia, and France regarded the whole of that contested ground as within its own sphere. The moment the English expedition appeared, the French authorities moved to expel it, and they moved with overwhelming weight. From Martinique and Guadeloupe, they sent a force reported in the range of 1,400 to 2,000 men, a body of troops that dwarfed anything Uring's little colony could field. And this is where the arithmetic turned lethal. Because of the several hundred who had landed, the number actually fit to fight, actually able to stand and defend the position, was reported at around 80. 80 men in condition to bear arms, against something between 1,400 and 2,000. The rest were sick, or unfit, or simply not soldiers. Consider what should have happened here, if the story the shares were sold on had been true. This was the exact scenario the defense gun was built for. A small Christian force, badly outnumbered, holding a fixed position against a much larger enemy advancing on it. That is the entire use case. That is, the fight, the tripod, and the revolving cylinder and the 9 shots a minute were designed to win. The outnumbered defender turning a narrow approach into a killing ground. The position weapon making up in firepower what the garrison lacked in numbers. If ever there was a moment for the wonder weapon to earn its legend, a moment for 2 defense guns to hold a beach against 20 times their number, this was it. The weapon had been carried across an ocean for precisely this. It did not happen. There is no account of the defense guns being fired in the island's defense, no record of them cutting down the advancing French, no legend even, and the reason is the cold one that governs the whole venture. 80 fit men against nearly 2,000 is not a fight that a rate of fire can save. 2 temperamental, complicated, slow-to-service position guns, however clever, do not change a ratio like that, and Uring was far too experienced a man to throw away his people in a hopeless stand for a rich man's real estate claim. The English position was untenable from the moment the French force appeared, and everyone competent could see it. Rather than be destroyed, the expedition negotiated its withdrawal. An agreement to evacuate was reached, and by the 8th of January, 1723, the colonists were leaving. 11 days after landing on the island that was to be the seed of a private empire, the whole enterprise was over. The cost of that 11 days has been reckoned at around £40,000, a genuine fortune, poured into an ocean crossing, a landing, and a retreat that gained the Duke nothing but the confirmation that other men's soldiers were closer than his own. And the 2 defense guns, the only examples of the weapon ever to reach anything resembling a theater of war, came home unfired. The machines sold as the answer to exactly this situation had been carried to exactly this situation and had answered nothing, because the situation was never really a firepower problem. It was a numbers problem, and a supply problem, and a diplomacy problem, and no gun on a tripod solves those. The only field deployment in the entire history of the defense gun produced no combat, no vindication, and no story except the story of a well-funded failure that folded in a week and a half. We know the shape of the fiasco in such detail largely because Nathaniel Uring, the seaman who commanded the landing, wrote it down. His memoirs survive, and they give the plain, unheroic account of a competent officer handed an impossible brief. The crossing, the landing on the 28th of December, the sudden appearance of the French from Martinique and Guadeloupe, the swift and correct understanding that the position could not be held, the negotiation, the withdrawal. Uring had spent his life in those waters, and he read the situation without flinching and without theatrics. There was nothing to be gained by dying for a land claim the French would never concede and the English government would never seriously reinforce. He got his people off the island alive and went on with his career, and the Duke of Montagu absorbed the loss and the humiliation. What Uring's account does not dwell on, and the silence is the loudest fact in it, is the wonder weapon in the hold. The 2 defense guns are a footnote to their own only campaign, carried across an ocean and carried home again, unremarked because there was, in the end, nothing to remark. A weapon sold to the public as the future of war left no trace on the one expedition it ever joined. That absence is its own kind of verdict, and a harsher one than any satirist could have written. And by the time those guns came back across the Atlantic, the company that had sold shares in their promise had already met its own reckoning at home. The bubble had burst. The fortunes of 1720 had turned to paper, and then to nothing. And the defense gun, the Christian machine against the Turk, the wonder that fired in the rain, had been handed its true and lasting place in history, not by the army that refused it, and not by the French who never had to face it, but by a satirist with a printing press and a very sharp eye for what the whole thing had actually been. Only wounded who hold shares. When the South Sea bubble burst in the autumn of 1720, it did not fall alone. It took the whole swarm of bubble companies down with it, the Walnut Tree Ventures and the Perpetual Motion Wheels and the undertakings of great advantage that nobody was to know. And the public that had bought all that paper on the way up discovered, on the way down, that most of it had never been worth anything at all. The rage that followed was enormous. Fortunes had vanished. Families were ruined. Parliament launched investigations. Directors of the South Sea Company were disgraced and stripped of their estates. And the country set about the grim work of accounting for what it had done to itself. And in that reckoning, a particular kind of art form flourished. Because when a whole society has been made a fool of, it wants, above all, to laugh at the con. The satire of 1720 was savage and inventive, and one of its most famous productions was a deck of cards. In London, the print seller Thomas Bowles issued a set of what became known as the bubble cards, a full deck in which each card mocked one of the failed schemes of the mania, naming the company, picturing its absurdity, and printing beneath it a short, cruel verse. It was a whole gallery of the year's follies, dealt out 52 at a time, so that the very people who had been ruined could hold their ruin in their hands and play a game with it. And among the schemes the deck singled out for mockery was the defense gun. The card showed the machine doing its work, but the men falling in front of the muzzle, cut down by the wonder weapon, were not Turks. They were not the enemies of Christendom. They were ordinary Englishmen in their tricorn hats, the investors themselves, the buyers of the shares, mowed down by the very gun they had paid to build. And beneath the picture ran the verse that has outlived every share certificate the company ever printed, a rare invention to destroy the crowd of fools at home instead of foes abroad. Fear not, my friends, this terrible machine, they're only wounded who have shares therein. 4 lines, and they close every loop this story has opened. Every element of the promotion is turned inside out and handed back. The wonder weapon designed to destroy the foe abroad is revealed as a machine for destroying the fool at home. The fearsome engine that was going to teach the Turk a lesson is defanged into a joke. Fear not, my friends, this terrible machine, because the only people it can actually hurt are the ones holding its stock. And the whole promise of the venture, the profit, the defense, the empire, collapses into a single savage pun on the word wounded. The defense gun defended nothing. It wounded the only people it ever touched, and it touched them through their purses. Remember the name. The gun was called the defense gun, sold as protection, marketed as the thing that would keep the buyer safe. And the verdict of history, printed on a playing card and dealt across the coffee houses of a ruined city, was that the only defense it ever provided was for the promoters, and the only wounds it ever inflicted were on the defended. A weapon named for safety became a byword for being fleeced. That is, the payoff the whole promotion had been building toward without knowing it, and it was delivered not by an army or a court, but by an anonymous versifier with a gift for the killing line. The savagery of that satire was not aimed at Puckle alone. It was the whole tone of the reckoning. The collapse of 1720 produced a flood of prints, ballads, and cards mocking the schemes and the schemers, a national catharsis rendered in ink, and the sharpest wits of the age turned their tools on the wreckage. The mania became a byword, a permanent piece of English shorthand for the moment a crowd mistakes rising paper for real wealth, and the print sellers grew rich, selling the ruined public pictures of its own foolishness. The defense gun earned its small, fixed place in that gallery of folly, one card among many, and it earned that place precisely because it was so perfectly emblematic. A weapon that never armed anyone, sold to people who never received anything, defended by a story about a war it never fought. The satirists did not have to exaggerate a single detail. They only had to describe the thing accurately, and let the description do the work. And that is the surest sign that a scheme has failed all the way down to the bottom, the moment when the plain, unembellished truth of it is already the joke, and the mockery and the history have become the same sentence. The company did not survive the reckoning, and it left little behind to mourn. There was no factory to close, because there had barely been a factory. There was no product line to discontinue, because the product had never really existed in numbers. There were a handful of finished guns, 2 or 3, scattered into the hands of collectors and curiosities, and a quantity of worthless shares in the possession of people who had learned the hard way to read a patent more skeptically than a promise. The defense gun passed, in the space of a few short years, from impossible number to crown-granted patent to holy crusade to Caribbean fiasco to punchline on a card, and at the end of that passage there was almost nothing left of it but the joke. And the man whose name it carried, the lawyer who had written a book warning young men against exactly this kind of scheme, had only a few years left to live with what his name had become. The ledger closed. James Puckle died in 1724. The bare dates give his life as beginning in 1667 and ending in 1724, which would make him about 57, though some accounts of his death record a younger age, and the discrepancy is one more small thing the records do not perfectly resolve. He died in London, the city where he had practiced his law and written his books and floated his gun, and he died within 2 years of the St. Lucia expedition, within 4 years of the bubble that had carried his weapon to its brief fame and its lasting ridicule. He did not live to see his machine vindicated, and in 1724 there was no vindication to see. There was only a failed venture, a scattering of guns, and a satirical card. And here the story arrives at the distinction it has been circling from the beginning, the distinction between a company and a name. The company was nothing. It had raised some money, made 2 or 3 guns, and dissolved into the wreckage of 1720, leaving no factory, no workforce, no going concern, nothing that could be inherited or sold or revived. By every measure that a business is measured, it had ceased to exist, and it had barely existed to begin with. But the name did not die with the company, and that is the peculiar afterlife that certain ventures earn. Puckle the man was mortal and died in 1724. Puckle the company was a phantom that had never really lived. But Puckle the name, attached to a strange gun and a stranger patent, turned out to have a durability that the enterprise itself never possessed, and it survived by attaching itself to 2 things the company had almost accidentally produced: a small, honest book and a small, dishonest-looking gun that happened to contain an honest idea. What did the ledger show when it closed on him? On the debit side, almost everything. A weapon rejected by the one customer with an army. A company that manufactured perhaps 2 or 3 guns while selling shares in the promise of thousands. A single real deployment that collapsed in 11 days without the guns firing a shot. A name attached, permanently now, to one of the follies of 1720, printed and dealt and laughed at across London. By every measure a promoter uses to judge a venture, the defense gun was a failure, and a public one. And yet the ledger has a second column. And it is here that the strangest turn in the whole story begins to show itself, quietly, in 1724, long before anyone could read it properly. Because the same man who left behind a laughingstock of a gun had also left behind that small moral book, the club, the father's advice to the son. And while the gun rusted into curiosity, the book kept being read. It was reprinted through the decades, and then through the century, and then into the next century, still in print at the end of the 1800s, nearly 200 years after Puckle wrote it, a modest classic of plain English good sense. Here was the deepest irony of the man's whole life, planted in his first chapter and paying off in his last. James Puckle is remembered by weapons enthusiasts for a gun that mocked the very scheming his book had warned against. But he was also, for 2 centuries, quietly remembered by ordinary readers for the book itself, the honest advice, the warning against the projector, outliving the projection. The moralist outlasted the promoter. The little book about how to live an honest life stayed in print longer than anyone stayed fooled by the gun. The guns themselves did not vanish. That is the thing about a failed promotion that leaves physical objects behind. The objects have a way of surviving precisely because they are strange, because there are so few of them, because a curiosity is easier to keep than to throw away. The handful of defense guns that were actually made drifted into the great houses and collections of the following centuries. Two of them found their way to the estates of the Duke of Montagu, the very man whose Caribbean dream they had failed to defend, and they can be found associated with his former homes to this day. Others surfaced in famous collections around the world, examples reaching the Great Arsenal Museum in St. Petersburg, an example held among the treasures of the Imperial Palace in Beijing, an example associated with the Tower of London itself. The gun that armed almost no one became, over time, a prized rarity in the finest weapons collections on Earth, valued not for what it did, but for what it was, the first of something, even if it had failed at being that thing. Because that is the claim that would not die, the claim that would eventually turn the whole verdict of this story on its head. The defense gun had failed as a weapon, and failed as a business, and failed as an empire's shield. But the idea inside it, the thing on the patent, the thing that the Board of Ordnance was too practical and the investors too greedy to see clearly, had never actually been wrong. It had only been early. And 150 years after James Puckle died with his name on a joke, the world would build his machine for real, and it would change everything. A century too early. The verdict that mattered was not delivered in 1720 by a satirist, and it was not delivered in 1718 by the Board of Ordnance. It was delivered, slowly, across the following century and a half, by other men in other workshops who arrived, one after another, at the exact idea James Puckle had drawn on paper and could not make work. And their verdict was the opposite of the cards. The idea was right. The machine was real. It had simply been born into a world whose metal, whose chemistry, and whose ammunition could not yet keep its promise. Trace the lineage, and it runs straight back to that patent. The core of Puckle's design was the revolving cylinder, a rotating block of preloaded chambers feeding a single barrel, and that is the beating heart of the revolver, the weapon that Samuel Colt would patent in 1836, and that would make his name and his fortune. Colt was born more than 100 years after Puckle filed patent 418, and the principle he built his empire on was the principle Puckle had described and failed to sell. The difference was not the concept. The concept was the same. The difference was that by Colt's day, the world could machine the parts precisely enough and load the chambers reliably enough and ignite them consistently enough to make the idea behave. Puckle had the idea in 1718. He did not have the century of metalworking that the idea needed, and no amount of investor money in 1720 could have bought a century that had not happened yet. Then push the lineage forward, from the pistol to the true machine gun, and the vindication becomes total. In 1862, in the middle of the American Civil War, Richard Gatling patented his hand-cranked gun, a rapid-fire weapon turned by a crank, pouring out fire at a rate no line of riflemen could match. And the Gatling gun is, in its logic, Puckle's defense gun with a century and a half of better engineering poured into it, a hand-operated, rapid-fire, position weapon meant to let a few men hold, a point against many. And then, in 1884, Hiram Maxim built the gun that removed even the crank, harnessing the recoil of each shot to load and fire the next, and produced the first true automatic machine gun, the weapon that would define the battlefields of the 20th century and cut down men by the hundreds of thousands. Every one of those weapons is a descendant of the same instinct, the instinct to break the silence between shots, to defeat the reload, to turn one position into a wall of continuous fire. It was the instinct James Puckle had followed into a courtyard in the rain, 63 shots in 7 minutes, in 1722. The scattered survivors carried that vindication quietly around the world. One brass example is reported to have been acquired for the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great, delivered in the years around the patent, and a brass defense gun survives to this day among the historic ordnance in St. Petersburg, though the details of that sale, like much of the money side of this story, come down reported rather than firmly documented. Others surfaced far afield. A set of the guns is said to have been presented to the Chinese emperor early in the 19th century, an English curiosity carried all the way to Beijing and preserved among imperial treasures under a Chinese name of its own. Whether every one of these travels unfolded exactly as tradition records it, the pattern they trace is unmistakable. The tiny handful of real defense guns became prized objects in the great collections of empires that had never used them, kept and catalogued and set behind glass, valued not as failures but as firsts, the earliest surviving hardware of an idea the world would take a century and a half to be ready for. The shares went into the fire of 1720 and left nothing. The guns went into palaces, and are there still. So the honest final judgment on the defense gun has to hold two things at once, and the discipline of this account is to hold them both rather than collapse into either. As a business, it It was very likely a bubble. A rejected weapon floated as a stock in the maddest market in English history, and mocked, fairly, as a machine for wounding its own shareholders. As an invention, it was ahead of its time by a margin that is genuinely staggering. A working sketch of the machine gun drawn 150 years before the machine gun could be built. The scam, if scam it was, lived in the finance. The truth lived in the physics. The men who bought the shares were fools, and the man who drew the patent was right. And both of those statements are true at the same time, about the same gun, and that is what makes it one of the strangest objects in the history of both war and money. Which is why the defense guns sit in museums today and the shares do not. The paper was worthless and is gone. But the machine, the 2 or 3 real machines, survived, because they turned out to be the first draft of one of the most consequential ideas in the history of warfare. James Puckle sold the wrong thing. He sold shares, and the shares were the fraud. What he should have been remembered for, and eventually was the idea, and the idea was no fraud at all. It was simply 100 years too early for the man who thought of it. And 100 years too early is, in the world of money, indistinguishable from a lie. Only history can tell the difference, and history takes longer than a bubble. Add it all up, the way an analyst closes a ledger. 1 patent, number 418, granted in 1718. 1 gun, a tripod-mounted flintlock revolver, 3 feet of barrel, a bore of 1 1/4 inch, a cylinder of 6 to 11 preloaded chambers, capable in a wet courtyard of 63 shots in 7 minutes. 1 company, formed to promote and manufacture it, that sold shares to the public and produced, across its entire life, perhaps 2 guns, perhaps 3. 1 real customer, a duke, who bought 2 of them for a private empire that lasted 11 days. 1 satirical playing card, printed in the wreckage of 1720, that fixed the whole thing forever as a machine for wounding its own shareholders. And 1 man, a lawyer and writer from Norwich, dead by 1724, who had warned the world against exactly the kind of scheme his name would come to stand for. That is the inventory. It is a very small pile of objects to have generated 3 centuries of retelling. The story lives, as these stories always do, in the gap between 2 things that were never the same, the invention and the venture. The invention was real. The revolving cylinder feeding a single barrel was a genuine and genuinely early piece of engineering, a working sketch of the machine gun drawn 150 years before the world could build one. The venture was a bubble. A rejected weapon floated as a stock in the maddest market England had ever known, sold on a story about a war it never fought, mocked at the end as fairly as anything was ever mocked. Both statements are true, about the same gun, at the same time. The physics were sound. The finance was the fraud. And almost everyone who has ever told this story has picked one of those truths and dropped the other, which is why it is worth holding both, because the whole meaning is in the contradiction. Restate the decisions as the market problems they were meant to solve, and each one comes back clean. The problem of the silent pause between shots, the enemy walking toward the soldier while he reloaded, was answered by the revolving cylinder and the promise of 9 shots a minute. The problem of a weapon rejected by the only army that could buy it was answered by turning the weapon into a security and selling shares instead of guns. The problem of persuading strangers to fund a machine most of them would never see was answered by the oldest tool there is, a frightening enemy and a righteous cause, the Turk and the square bullet. And the problem of making a fragile idea look solid enough to invest in was answered by a patent, sealed by the Crown, described in the new and convincing detail the law had lately started to require. Every one of those was, on its own terms, a shrewd solution. The man was not a fool. He solved every problem in front of him with real skill. He simply solved the wrong set of problems, the problems of selling the thing rather than the problems of making it work. And restate the errors the same way, as decisions with a cost. The decision to build a weapon of such intricacy that the workshops of 1718 could barely make it, and could never make it reliable, cost the gun the 1 customer, the Board of Ordnance, whose order would have made it real. The decision to answer that rejection by selling shares rather than fixing the gun cost the venture its integrity and tied its fate to the doomed frenzy of 1720. The decision to sell on fear and spectacle, the square bullets, the holy war, cost the enterprise its credibility the moment the fear was tested and the spectacle produced 2 guns. And the great structural error underneath all of them, the decision to let the paper run so far ahead of the product that a company promising to arm an empire manufactured a handful of guns, cost the shareholders everything, which is exactly what the playing card said, in 4 lines, better than any ledger could. They were only wounded who held shares therein. So why did the name survive, when the company did not and the shares turned to ash? It survived because, in the end, it stood for 2 true things wrapped inside all the false ones. It survived because of a small moral book, The Club, a father's plain advice to a son, that outlasted the gun in print by nearly 200 years and kept the name attached to something honest. And it survived because the gun, for all the fraud built on top of it, contained an idea that turned out to be right. And the world eventually built that idea for real, in the revolver and the Gatling and the Maxim, and traced the lineage back to a patent from 1718. The company was worthless and is forgotten. The name is remembered, because a name can attach itself to an idea, and an idea, unlike a company, can be a century early and still, in the end, come true. The precision of what that name means, the first patented machine gun, one of the first patents to describe its invention in full, is a precision that men paid for, some at auction and some in worthless shares. And the difference between those two prices is the whole subject. If you want to understand how a real invention can be destroyed by the way it is sold, how a sound idea and a rotten venture can wear the same name and go to opposite ends, and how history needs longer than a bubble to tell the difference between a man who was lying and a man who was simply too early, the Puckle gun is the case to study.